Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan, and this is Not Just Cute, the podcast, where we discuss all kinds of topics to help bridge the gap that exists between what we know and what we do in early childhood education. We're starting conversations with academics, authors, decision makers, educators, and parents so that together we can improve the quality of early childhood education, while at the same time protecting and respecting the childhood experience. Matis Miller is the author of the new book, The Uncontrollable Child. He's a licensed clinical social worker and therapist, and the founder, director, and supervisor of the Center for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy of New Jersey. And as you'll hear towards the end, he's also a father to quite an impressive brood of kiddos. All of this experience combined gives him a unique perspective on challenging child behaviors. Matis is certified in both cognitive and dialectical behavioral therapies, which he'll explain in our chat, but I want to put this out right now. Don't get too bogged down in these clinical terms. While they are rooted in important research and clinical practice, they also have very relatable and ordinary applications that may be the missing piece for addressing some challenging behaviors in your home or classroom. One of the things I really appreciated in my discussion with Matis is the perspective of dialectics, which helps us to find the balance point between extremes, something that I think is often missing in conversations about challenging childhood behaviors. It's easy to find headlines about the one thing that everyone must know or the 5 tips to change behavior today. But what is often missing is the very real and necessary discussions about finding the right balance between two ideas that seem like opposites. For example, think about acceptance and change, which Matis and I talk about in our discussion. We want children to know that they are accepted 100% for who they are right now. But when we see challenging behaviors, we're also looking for change, right? So how do we balance these two concepts that seem to be in contradiction? Change within acceptance. These are the discussions where Matis thrives, and I found his perspective really fascinating. We'll discuss mindfulness, re-examine the shoulds of child behavior, and dig deep into finding the balance that works for the children right in front of you. Before we begin, I wanted to let you know that I'm offering a free mini course covering 5 keys to intentional whole child development. This course has spread like wildfire through teaching teams looking to get on the same page with their intentional whole child approach. If you'd like to learn more about how to implement and advocate for developmentally appropriate, responsive early education, sign up for this free course in today's show notes. You can find those show notes for this episode at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 43. Matis Miller brings a wealth of both research and experience to his new book, and if you stick with us to the end, you'll not only gain some valuable new perspectives, you'll also hear how you can enter to win a free copy of the book for yourself. This book has been endorsed by powerhouses like Dr. John Gottman and Dr. Judith Beck. In other words, you don't want to miss this. If you've been wanting to show up to behavior challenges with more confidence and clarity, you are in the right place. Let's jump in. Matis, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me, Amanda. It's wonderful to be here.
So you have a new book called The Uncontrollable Child, and there are some really interesting perspectives on challenging child behaviors that I'm really excited to get into. But I really love starting out asking people about their professional path. So I'm curious if you would be willing to share a little bit about what it is that drew you to work with young children and their families and what continues to motivate you today in that work.
Sure, absolutely. So as of a very young age, I was really interested in being involved or helping people. It was actually through my teenage years, I worked in a summer camp with kids who had chronic illness, cancer, and other struggles. And I really liked to give. And I always had that. I think people always felt comfortable around me. Even my friends, I look back at my yearbook. They saw me being a therapist one day. I guess it was in my DNA. So at a very young age, I realized that this is a path I wanted to take. So immediately after college, I started my master's in social work. And even throughout my schooling, I appreciated what I was learning, but I guess it's partly because my personality but I felt it wasn't as structured and focused. A lot of the schooling differently today, but it was very focused on psychoanalytical, psychodynamic therapy. And I was like, this is wonderful, like making people the trust, the comfort, the connection. But then what am I doing to get them to where they want to be? And early on in my career, I always had that interest. And as I started my different positions as clinical social worker, I started to explore more evidence-based treatments, which geared me towards cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy. At that point, I went through the Beck Institute of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, went through intensive training. Following the years after that, further into dialectical behavioral therapy and other evidence-based treatments and practices. I've worked with children and adolescents, but primarily today I work with adults and adolescents. I work in a private practice, my own group private practice setting, and we do individual, family, we have lots of groups as well. So CBT, DBT is just a more structured, goal-oriented, focused form of psychotherapy, more action-based. There's homework, we're measuring goals, research-based. So that's where I'm at now. I'm also doing a lot of lecturing and educating and training at this point as well.
I love that. And I'm always interested in people who take that next step like you did, that this is great, but what else is there? And let me follow some more of the data and build on that and keep asking questions. I love curious people.
And I'm not done yet.
Right? There's always another thing to explore.
That's right.
And I love, as you're talking about these things, they all, I think for a lot of people probably sound really, really complicated. And that's actually one of the things we'll get to in just a minute, that these are big, complicated clinical research type things, but the application is something that's happening in homes and families and classrooms every single day. And so I love that you can take those complicated things and put them into everyday applications that people can access.
Absolutely. Even as a therapist, my goal is to help my clients become their own therapists, to really take this knowledge and skill and apply it to themselves and to their families. And I think that's super important. A lot of times we get stuck in all this jargon, and it's hard to take that and utilize that. So it's super important that people understand that you can really break this down. And I do a lot of that in the book and in my teaching, giving it over in a really clear, organized, step-by-step, practical way that they can implement in their lives.
Now let's start with, your book is called The Uncontrollable Child, which is a very provocative title, right? So what are some of these challenges that you're seeing that you're helping people with? How would you describe that uncontrollable child?
I don't think there's a singular definition for the uncontrollable child, and the child might come with some diagnoses. Primarily, I see it as a child who's more emotionally sensitive, reactive. It's that child that takes longer to get back to baseline, more irritable, moody. And because of those emotional states, that leads to a lot of non-compliance and impulsivity and just giving you a rough time. And I think the uncontrollable child is more of us as caregivers are saying, we feel out of control. Help, what do I do with this child? And many children at different stages, developmental stages, can trigger that within us. So I do talk about a little bit that uncontrollable child being a child who might have a diagnosis of ADHD, or some of you might be familiar with ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. There's actually a newer diagnosis, which it hasn't been discussed much, I think, in terms of the research in the book, called DMDD. It's a childhood diagnosis, which is disrupted mood dysregulation disorder. And I think this is really that emotional sensitive child. And if we think about it, for those of you who are familiar with borderline personality disorder, which is a very, very severe and debilitating disorder, it's the underlying core struggle that many adults have to cope with when they have that is that emotion dysregulation, that emotional sensitivity. And I think sometimes a part of that is their biology, is their makeup. And the environment doesn't know how to respond to that. And that leads to further dysregulation. And I believe that DMDD is probably a presentation of a lot of those difficulties that I think we were quick to say, oh, this child has bipolar disorder. But this child is really just a more emotionally sensitive child, which has lots of strengths and struggles, and helping people be able to, and it feels out of control. It feels out of control for them, and it feels out of control for us.
Mm-hmm. I love that distinction that you make, that, the title, like you said, titles of books that are there to help parents and caregivers are written to their perspective, right? So that, like you said, the adults are the ones that are often saying, this is an uncontrollable child. Here are all the problems. And I love that you pull it back to the root to say, that's what you see. And that's why you're going to pick up this book. Exactly. But now I'm going to guide you to see, here's where it actually comes from. And just that perspective that you bring, that it's the environment needing to learn to respond as well. There's a give and a take, right? That instead of just trying to fix children, right? It's helping us to have a more holistic view to see, help me understand this child a little bit better. Right?
Absolutely. And you said that so well. And I think children don't grow up starting to think they're uncontrollable. I think they start to think they're uncontrollable when their environment perceives them and treats them as uncontrollable. Mm-hmm. And then they start to internalize this message, something's wrong with me. I'm out of control. I'm not normal. And if parents are able to understand, get in touch with their own emotions, at the same time understand, like you said, the causes of where this child's coming from, with their struggles, and help that child develop, then that message of there's something wrong with me likely won't stick, and they can grow up and be successful.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you feel like some of these challenging behaviors, you rattle off, some people call it the alphabet soup, right? Of these challenging behaviors. Do you find that do you feel like they are more common today? Do you feel like we are just getting better at diagnosing things? Do you feel like we're getting better at recognizing and labeling? Or do you feel like there's actually something going on that's causing more challenging behaviors? That's probably a multifaceted question there, right? Yeah.
It's a great question. And to be honest, I don't have that exact answer. I don't think from the research it's clear. I mean, we're definitely diagnosing more. We have more services. So perhaps we're seeing it more in numbers. I don't have much evidence. If we'd ask our grandparents or our great-grandparents, they might describe it differently, right? That child or that struggle. But I think it's, thank God today we have so many more interventions and how to help children with these struggles. Labeling is a slippery slope, as I talk a little bit about in the book, that alphabet soup. We don't want the child to use that label as a crutch or use that label to put themselves in a box or a define. At the same time, the label helps us understand what their needs are and how to treat them in the classroom. How to help them compensate for their weaknesses and struggles and develop their strengths. So it's super important. So I wouldn't say I think there's more of it. I think there are some things we probably are seeing more of, certainly during these very challenging times, such as anxiety, certainly family conflict, substance abuse. So I think during certain times, can I tell you that during World War I, there weren't those struggles too? I don't know enough of the data back then, but I think we're definitely during these times seeing an uptick in a lot of emotional struggles for children.
So interesting. Now, as I mentioned before, one of your gifts that I've been reading about is that you're really good at taking complicated things and explaining them in a way that people can relate. So a few of the things I was hoping that you could define for some of those of us who are not in clinical work. Your practice is in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is referred to as CBT. And then your book particularly focuses on DBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy, correct? And I say all those terms, right?
Right.
So yeah. Can you explain some of those terms for those of us that don't come from a clinical background?
Sure. So cognitive or cognition is our thoughts, our thinking pattern. And research shows that we have between 60 to 80,000 thoughts going through our mind daily. And often we're not aware of these thoughts, but we don't know that these thoughts directly impact our emotion and our behavior. So in CBT, what we do is we are, as individuals and children, we're often aware of what we're feeling. We're aware of our distress, our misery, our anxiety, our pain, our anger. We're not aware what's going through our mind. Aaron Beck and others who develop cognitive behavioral therapy and have done a lot of research have identified that if we can become more aware of our thinking patterns, and often those thinking patterns aren't as true as we think they are, or they're not very helpful. And if we can identify those thinking patterns and learn how to question them and see the evidence for and against, or change the way we're thinking, that directly will impact our emotion and behavior. So that in cognitive behavioral therapy, we're addressing cognition, changing cognition, or the belief system. At the same time, we're also addressing behavior and emotion. And if you think about it like going downwards from thought to emotion, behavior, really behavior also affects emotion, which affects thought. And if you look at it like a gear, if you address any of those areas, it affects the other. So if someone, the classic, one of the CBT treatments for phobias or anxiety is something called exposure. So we know if we do something repeatedly, then the anxiety will go down and our belief or threat of danger will change as well. Or we can address the thought itself that help them see that the thought is not as true as they think, which can help decrease the anxiety, which can change their behavior and their ability to approach. So we're working on all ends of cognition, emotion, and behavior with a real focus specifically on the cognition and the belief system that's often developed in childhood.
It's a really holistic approach, it sounds like. And it feels like it has a stronger, like there's an internal locus of control, whereas there's, some of these other approaches feel a little, to me, maybe feel a little less accessible. And that it feels like from what you're describing that it gives each person a more active role and a bit of autonomy in that process of being able to control, that you can control your thoughts.
Yeah, and empowers them. And often we're teaching them that they feel like they can't control their thoughts because they don't know how. So we know, let's say thought suppression doesn't work. Pushing away thoughts doesn't help you. Avoiding just makes things worse. In the short term, you feel great when you avoid, and that's why we do it. It makes sense. Dialectical behavioral therapy, I'd like to call a cousin of CBT. It's actually under the umbrella of cognitive behavioral therapy. It was developed by a woman named Marshall Linehan in the 80s, and it's a subset of CBT. Actually, her first book is called Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Borderline Personality Disorder. People don't know that, but it was actually developed as a CBT treatment. And she integrated and infused a couple concepts to broaden the CBT model for the specific population for those with BPD. However, today, DBT is used everywhere. It's used in corporate, it's used in medical settings, it's used for children, for adolescents, for adults, for substance abuse, for eating disorders. And the research that is showing that it's extremely effective for many of these difficulties. So you talk about those words, dialectical. It sounds a little bit scary. Dialectical comes, it's similarly from the root word of dialogue. And dialectics is the idea that there can be two concepts that are opposite or appear opposite. And those opposing concepts can both be true at the same time. And you mentioned to me earlier when we were speaking before, is that you had an interest in the idea of acceptance and change. And that's where DBT was really born, is because Marshall Linehan, in her work, when she was working with those who were struggling with borderline personality disorder, she found, she took individuals who were really struggling with suicide and self-harm, and she took them off medication, and she wanted to do the research. And she was a behaviorist. She was a behavioral psychologist, and she wanted to work on change. And she sat down and said, let's break down your problems. Let's come up with solutions. All the teachers and us, let's figure this out and change these behaviors. And she got this pushback. You don't get what I'm going through. You don't understand my pain. How can you just sit here and do this? And then she said, okay, this is not working. She took a step back. And then she said, maybe I have to validate. Maybe I have to understand. Maybe I have to help them just embrace what is. Maybe we can change it. Maybe we need to accept it. And she started to do that work. And the response she got for that is, you don't think I can change? There's no hope? And that's where she started to see this dialectic. Because if you're changing, you're not accepting, you're working on changing. And if you're accepting, then you're not changing either. So she understood that both these concepts are important, and I need to make a synthesis of these two opposites. And dialectics really teaches us, and that's where I brought it into parenting and into teaching, is so important for us to be able to make room for opposing concepts, to be able to find the truth and to balance. Because there is not one, and Amanda, you could tell me this more than, in terms of the classroom and development, but I would imagine there's not one way or one method to interact with a child.
Right.
And it's the ability to open our minds and try to, see what things we can change and what things we have to accept. If there's a child who's a learning disability, We might want them to lead in a certain way, and we're pushing for that, and we're fighting the reality, which is actually getting in the way of change. It's a little deeper concept there, but actually, because however, if we can accept and get in touch with where the child is, at the same time, work on change and balancing those two, that will be more effective. So Marsha Linehan brought mindfulness, validation, acceptance-based strategies into change strategies. So CBT is very change-focused, and she really integrated a lot of this mindfulness acceptance in this balance and helping people move towards change.
That was really an aha to me when I was looking over those things, that realization. I mean, that is the tension that I feel, whether it's as parents or as teachers, that, we want to change, we want to improve, we want to help children improve and change. And at the same time, we want them to feel validated and accepted for who they are. And I just don't know that I've heard somebody speak to it the way that you did, that you have to balance those two, that they feel completely accepted and validated. And at the same time, there is room for growth. And how do we, manage that dance so that we're not at odds with them or making them feel less than or broken, but that we can work together and be accepting while also growing and changing at the same time.
And that's true for ourselves too.
That's a good reminder.
That's right. That we need to accept ourselves for where we're at while balancing. And I try to give that message as a parent. We have these dreams, fantasies, ideologies of how we want our children to be, or expectations of our home. And we get frustrated, or sometimes we feel like, I'm so overwhelmed. I'm trying to work. I'm trying to take care of my kids. I'm such a bad mom, and that gets in the way also of accepting ourselves, that we're doing the best we can as we work to become better and change, so we don't get stuck.
Oh, I love that. That's such an important reminder. I think especially right now, there are so many parents and teachers and families who are juggling so many things, and it is really easy to get frustrated with ourselves, right? Will you, along with that balance of accepting while also growing and changing, you also talk about letting go of the shoulds and practicing mindfulness. So I have a two-part question with that one. First of all, what does that look like? That's probably an unfair question, because you're like, well, it's in this chapter, right? It's a very in-depth explanation. But generally, what does that look like to let go of the shoulds and to practice more mindfulness? And what would you say to those who maybe push back on that idea as though it's permissive or laissez-faire parenting or classroom management, that when we are that this idea of acceptance and letting go of shoulds can lead to that permissiveness?
I want to respond to the last thing you said, and I don't want to get into the shoulds, because I actually found that when I would meet with parents, they would tend to vacillate on extremes in their parenting. Either the laissez-faire, acceptance, unconditional positivity. No, we don't want to be too tough on our children. In our home, we try not to say no. We just focus on the positive and build their strengths. And then I have the other end where the parents are, no, my parents, this is the way it was. This is the way it should be. And I'm going to put up those limits, give those consequences, punish my children. They are going to learn. And both those extremes are problematic. And it's not a 50-50 in the middle, but I think research shows that both those strategies are important. So I hear the permissive, overly permissive. We know from research, it doesn't help our children develop, but we also know that the punitive, critical, demanding, non-accepting on the other end is also problematic in finding that balance. I think the shoulds is a big piece of it, because when we talk about struggle with acceptance and we talk about being mindful, very often we're non-judgmental. We're judgmental. We're judgmental of ourselves. We're judgmental of our children. We're judgmental of society. And most of that is because we have these should beliefs, should thoughts, that there's a way things should be. So when parents come to me and they share with me, well, my child is out of control. She shouldn't be acting like this. She absolutely should be acting like this. And I look at them, I said, yes, she should. And they look at me, I'm paying all this money for you to tell me my child should be acting like this? Right. And I'm giving them the message is that doesn't mean that we approve of it, that we're happy with it, that we want it to be this way. Should means that your child is hitting or not listening because there is a cause. And when we say it shouldn't be that way, that's us putting our desire, our interpretation, our reality on what is, which is going to lead to anger, frustration, and get in the way of our ability to accept the child and again move towards change. There's so much, they're very much connected. Now, those of you who are listening say, what do you mean there's no should? Of course there are shoulds, right? Yes, there's a place for shoulds in terms of our morals and values of how we want things to be. So we should be kind to other people. We should be respectful. That we should follow a certain moral code. However, when a child is in this situation and acting the way they're acting, that's what should be happening in the moment until there is change. So it's very important when we're mindful and we're dialectical to be aware of those shoulds. And we might not be aware of the should, but when you're feeling some anger, there's likely a should there. And reminding yourself that everything is exactly as it should be until there's change. And that doesn't mean we approve. That doesn't mean we don't want it that way. And it doesn't mean that we're not sad and hurt and upset. But what you'll find is if you let go of shoulds, the anger dissipates, the anger lowers, and then we can open our eyes into the situation a whole different way. Is that clear?
Yes, I love it. You know, it reminds me of times I've worked with teachers, and a common thing that I would hear is they did this, whatever challenging behavior, they did this for no good reason. And I would say, well, you might not see a good reason, but there's a reason. And until we can stop and look for that reason, we're not going to be able to change this behavior. We can't just, I think it kind of puts this, it kind of makes it personal, right? They did it for no good reason. It's just to make me mad kind of a thing. Well, let's step back and see what was the reason. I think when we let go of those shoulds, I love the way you put it. It's almost poetic that they should, because there's something that is causing that. And until we can stop and look at that, then that's exactly what they should do. They're going to keep responding to that, that environment, that stimulus, whatever it is, that's
cause.
Yeah.
And I think that gets into mindfulness. And I know mindfulness is a buzzword today, but there's a part of mindfulness that's all about being effective and being present in the moment and being open, but doing what works in the moment. And that's something that Marshall Lenehan in her mindfulness skills brought in the concept of effectiveness, which is my favorite word. And, you know, when you talk about that teacher coming and saying, well, they shouldn't be doing this, or I followed this program and it should work. The answer is it's not should or not, is it effective for this child? And we as parents, as teachers, we want to think about our long-term goals, not get stuck in what's principally right. Well, I read all the research. This is how you're supposed to do it. The child is supposed to respond. Then have the parents fix this up. I'm not changing the curriculum in my classroom because, you know, you're telling me. And the answer is it's not effective. What's your goal? Your goal is for this child to be successful, to develop. You could continue doing what you think is principally right, but that's going to get in the way of the child being your long-term goals of doing what works. And mindfulness teaches us to constantly take a step back and saying, is this effective? Is this working? Mindfulness is also about not doing anything. It's an acceptance strategy. It's about being aware of our own emotions, opening our eyes, seeing the environment, communicating, sticking to the facts, being able to differentiate between facts, emotions, interpretations, judgments. And it's the ability to, and this is hard for us all, every situation we're in is to see that moment with curiosity, with openness, with a newness and a freshness, and bring all our own childhood experience, our own expectations, our own training into the moment. And that's how we see it. Mindfulness trains us to take that step back and just observe without trying to change or manipulate. And we can learn a lot of things by doing that.
Yeah, and I even listening to you in that description, that step back, that curiosity, I think it brings an objectivity that, like you said, just lowers the temperature. It kind of separates from that emotion a little bit and lets you see things a little bit more clearly and process it. It just really resonates. I love that perspective. So there was another pairing that struck me that you talk about, which is, I know, also challenging for a lot of people, and that's balancing consistency and also flexibility, that you have that pairing as well, where either extreme is going to cause problems. So can you explain a little bit more about why we need both and how we find that balance?
Yeah, I think I often hear people say in terms of parenting or children, consistency, consistent. You must be consistent. You must be consistent. And the way I think about it is when I hear people say that, I said, as children, as humans, we're not dogs. We're more complicated than that. We have emotions, we have our own belief systems, we have different types of behaviors, different types of environments. Not that animals don't have that as well, and we do some great research by looking at animals. Consistency is really, really important in parenting, and I see very often that parents struggle with being consistent. At the same time, sometimes I see they're so focused on being consistent that they're not demonstrating flexibility, which is so important for a child, to model for the child. When the child comes and explains to you why they want to stay out a little bit later. No, curfew is curfew, right? There are those times that you need to show them, demonstrate, model that we need to bend, that there is a time to be reasonable, to hear the other person's side, to be flexible so they can see that. Now, that doesn't mean that once you're flexible and then they're going to come the next week and say, okay, can I do it again? That you got to go back. And that takes a lot of mindfulness and getting back on track. They're both important. It's a very hard balance. And it's also very hard when we're an emotional mind, when we're in that struggle, because, naturally we go to those extremes because it becomes too hard to put in the limit and we just don't want to deal with it anymore. Or we just feel like this kid is trying to manipulate us, get away with what they want, make things more complicated. So finding that balance, I can't give you an exact recipe for each child. At the same time, mindfulness, and I try to teach that throughout, and the ability to see, is this working? If you find that perhaps you're too much on one end, you might have to bring yourself a little bit back and restart. And yes, when you're trying to change your behavior, the beginning is going to be harder, but that over time will get easier. So I actually have a model of flexibility that I developed based on some other research from 𝐅𝐫𝐞𝐞. I don't know if you're familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the idea of, I think it's helpful. There are core values or things that they really would like in their family environment, and then make a space of flexibility. Maybe mom doesn't want Kayla to wear a certain type of clothing. Maybe she has a certain value system. Where could she be flexible during that adolescent stage? Even before it happens, it's good to think about these things. Like, where's some space of things that you would allow and feel comfortable? And become very clear, and do this with your partner and your spouse, between that core value area and the larger flexibility area, have a very a solid line around the entire circle, meaning between the core and the it's hard to explain.
And I'm picturing exactly the graphic, because you do have a great visual for that.
Yeah. Yes.
They're going to have to go find.
They have to go find it, but know those limits, those absolute no's, and stick to those. But if you make area flexible, it's easier to be consistent because you know where are my areas that I'm comfortably flexible, rather than get stuck in the moment and trying to find that balance. I guess the bottom line is, the conclusion is, it's all about balance, and they're both important. And really think about yourself. Think about your work environment. You want things to be consistent, but you also want a boss who's going to be flexible.
Right.
Important that creates a mutual respect and understanding, a connection, validation. So we really want to teach that and give that over to our children as well.
I love that. And I love that, as much as, like you said, we all want to say, here's the hard question, give me the one easy answer. And I love that you don't, because I love that the way that you formulate everything acknowledges the fact that children are unique individuals and that we have to be responsive, that's a key piece of healthy development and healthy relationships, is that responsivity to them and as well as to us, to know what are our boundaries that need to be in that core part of the diagram, right? That's going to be more consistent. And then what's the part that I can be flexible, and what are the part that my child needs to be more flexible? And that it requires a lot of introspection, a lot of observation and curiosity. And I love that you approach that and organize it in a way so that we can get our heads around it and feel like we're getting closer to our own easy answers or consistent answers without trying to give the same answer to everyone, because it's just not how it works.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'll tell you my secret. The way I get away with everything is every time they ask me a question, I just say it's a dialectic.
Right.
There's another side. So there's truth for it all.
Everything is a dialectic, and that is the challenge, and that is the beauty of it, right? Well, you have so many other tools in there. There's so many perspectives that you bring. It's just full of so many aha moments for parents and for caregivers to explore. And we'll remind everybody, the book is called The Uncontrollable Child. We'll have links in the podcast. And I wish that I could touch on every single tool here. But before we go, I do want to ask you one more general question, is how can parents and early childhood educators and caregivers, how can we do a better job of supporting one another and working together as we help young children who have challenging behaviors? Is there a key place for us to start to do a better job of supporting each other so that we can ultimately support children better?
I think that's something that we talked about today. It's a wonderful starting point that can lead to more support and understanding with one another, and that's letting go of judgment. I think so often, we're all different. We have our unique perspectives. And if we want to be able to support each other, starting to look, trying to find the kernel of truth in the other person's perspective. You don't have to absolutely agree with them, but just letting go of the judgment and say, be open to hear and listen and validate the truth, even if it's not something that you completely agree with or understand. I think if we could think dialectically, let go of judgments, be more open to one another, I think that would go a long way, because I think that's what leads to a lot of tension, is when we get stuck in the blame and the shoulds and you don't get it and you don't understand. And I think also if we change the way we think about other people, one thing we learned about in dialectics also is change is transactional. If people see that we're more flexible and open, they'll be more supportive and open to us. So you don't have to think it's for their benefit. Think about it's for you.
Right.
I'll come back now.
It's so wonderful. And I love that all of those principles, it's the same principles that are going to help us with our children are the principles that are going to help us with other adults, that these are, those deeper principles that we really need in so many different aspects of our lives and so many different aspects of society right now where we can benefit from this dialectical approach. I really appreciate you sharing that with us and helping us get a little taste of that. We'll dive into your book and get even more of that. It was such a pleasure. And I really appreciate the work that you do for families, for children, for adolescents. And thank you for taking the time to talk with us today on the podcast as well and to share that great work with us.
Okay, no, thank you for having me on. And can I just drop one more piece of information before we
Absolutely. Go? Please do.
I usually share this on a podcast at some point, but I didn't. But I think it helps people relate to me better and appreciate the book. Is that thank God I have 6 kids.
That is an important point to bring up.
That is important to point. And from 20-month-old to 60-year-old, and just in conclusion, is I feel compassionate towards parents, and I hope I give that over in the book. It's not easy, and especially have many different children about mental stages, emotional makeup. So I think in a way that's helped me in my work. And what I try to give over more than the CBT and the DBT is really being able to understand and connect to other parents and educators who are dealing with children. So I just wanted to share that.
I love that. I appreciate you adding that in. Thank you so much, Matis. This is fantastic work.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again for listening to Not Just Cute, the podcast. You can find show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 43. There you'll find links to Matis Miller's book, The Uncontrollable Child, as well as to his practice, along with other interesting tidbits addressed in this episode. Matis has also shared a free copy of his book to be given away to one listener. Head over to Instagram, make sure that you're following me at Amanda_NotJustCute, and leave a comment below the post showing The Uncontrollable Child. One of you will be selected at random to receive Matis's book. Head on over to Instagram to get all the details. You can also hit up the show notes for a link to the free mini course covering the 5 keys to intentional whole child development. Head to notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 43, or go straight to notjustcute.com/keys to get signed up and receive resources to help you implement and advocate for developmentally appropriate, responsive early education. I'm Amanda Morgan. You can read more on my blog and sign up for the Not Just Cute newsletter at notjustcute.com. And follow me on Facebook. That's facebook.com/notjustcute. I'm also sharing some new things on Instagram, so follow me there at Amanda_notjustcute. Thanks for listening today, and as always, thank you for standing up for children and for childhood.